Well, I'm going to do a little history. In the intellectual history of the debates on the Book of Abraham, in the 20th century, the first significant event is the Spalding pamphlet. In 1912, Franklin Spalding, who was the Episcopal Bishop of Utah, and by the way, not to be confused with Solomon Spalding, whose name gave rise to the dominant theory of Book of Mormon origins among anti-Mormons in the 19th century. But anyway, Franklin Spalding published a little pamphlet called Joseph Smith Jr. as a Translator. And this pamphlet was actually an attack on the Book of Mormon, not specifically the Book of Abraham. However, he tried to kind of bootstrap his argument by attacking the Book of Abraham. And the centerpiece of this pamphlet is he sent letters to 8 Egyptologists, or they weren't all Egyptologists, I would say Orientalists, giving them the facsimiles and Joseph's explanations, and he published letters back from them, all saying, oh, this is all wrong. And of course, 5 of the people he sent these letters to were his fellow Episcopalians. And in fact, looking back on it in hindsight, Spalding made a number of mistakes. I mean, he really had a good opportunity, and this was the right time to do this, and it was a good idea. But he could have executed better in certain respects. And one thing I want to mention is he never would release the correspondence he used to solicit these letters from these scholars. And it's obvious from the letters he got back, he had poisoned the well. You know, and we don't know what he said, but he must have said, you know, this is from Joseph Smith, and he's a quack, and, you know, so you give me a letter, you know, to buttress that. So if he had just done a blind solicitation, he probably would have got pretty much the same letters back anyway that wouldn't have hurt him, but he just didn't trust his position. And he probably should have trusted it, but he didn't. And so this leads us to the bibliography on this episode. So if you want to read this pamphlet, you can get a copy from the Tanners. So I'm advertising for the Tanners today. At the time, there was a massive LDS response to this pamphlet. And at least 24 articles appeared. Mostly they would appear in the newspaper, but then they would be republished in the Improvement era. So if you want to read these, one way to do it is to go to the BYU bookstore and start at 1912 and go to about 1918 and just flip through the issues and you'll find them. They're all over the place. Another way to do it, which might be easier for you that don't have access to an LDS library, Kerry Schertz, who is with us today, has many, and I haven't checked to see if they're all there, but I know he has many of these responses up on his website. For kind of a summary view of this, there's a paper by Samuel Mercer at the time, kind of summarizing this from the critic's perspective. And again, this is available from the Tanners. I think they packaged the Spalding pamphlet with Samuel Mercer's paper. And then for a summary from the point of view of the Saints, Nibley's 2-year serial in the Improvement era, beginning right in 1968, is a review of the whole Spalding incident. And then towards the end of that serial, he starts to get into facsimile 1. But most of this is a review of Spalding, and it's a lot of fun, if nothing else. It's a very fun read. So I highly encourage you to read that. Now you can find these in the old eras themselves, or there's an edited set of this in the Farms 2000 edition of Abraham in Egypt. Okay.
What happened to these documents, the papyri, after Joseph Smith had them? Well, he gave them to his mother, Lucy Mack Smith, and she used to show them in her house. People would come by and pay her in order to see the mummies and the papyri, and she would make a little bit of extra money doing this. And of course, Joseph had passed away, and so she kept possession of these. In 1856, she passed these on, or they were passed on rather, to Emma Smith, who had remarried at this time to Louis Bideman, and they took possession of it. Within 2 weeks, in fact, Emma, Louis, and Joseph III signed a bill of sale transferring them to Abel Combs. Now, it's possible that this may have confirmed a prior transaction in which William Smith may have pawned the antiquities for living expenses. We don't really know the relationship between William's supposed sale to this, so that's a little bit unclear. Combs promptly sold a portion of the collection containing 2 mummies and some papyri, which very probably included facsimile number 3, to the St. Louis Museum. Now, for a good article on this, you can read Walter Whipple's The St. Louis Museum and the 2 Egyptian Mummies. It was in a BYU studies. The St. Louis Museum was sold and moved to Chicago in 1863, and then sold again to Colonel Joseph Woods in January of 1864, who included the collection in the Woods Museum on Randolph Street. The Woods collection burned in the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, and it was long assumed that all the papyri, the entire Joe Smith collection, burned up in the fire as well. In reality, a portion of the collection, which would later come to the possession of the church, went to Combs' nurse, Charlotte Becker Weaver, Huntsman, after he died. Charlotte's daughter, Alice Combs Weaver, later Huser, brought the fragments to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York in 1918 for an evaluation, but the museum did not purchase them at the time. Ludlow Bull, an associate curator of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, reached out to Alice to see about acquiring the papyri in 1946. By that time, Alice had died, but her widowed husband, Edward Huser, now who was 80 years old, sold the pieces to the museum for an undisclosed sum of money, together with the original bill of sale from Emma Smith. Now, because of the bill of sale, the museum knew the connection with these papyri pieces to the Joseph Smith collection. This was Emma Smith, wife of Joseph Smith, and so they knew that what they had there. In the 1960s, the church was made aware of the existence of this collection, and negotiations to bring them back to the church eventually were successful, and the transfer took place in 1967. Now, there's a story of a University of Utah Coptic scholar, well-known Coptic scholar by the name of, I think it's pronounced Aziz Atiyah, and supposedly the story goes that he found them in a drawer at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and most scholars think that there's too many problems with that story, that it's probably not accurate. Now, there are several unsolved mysteries still regarding the papyri and the mummies that were not sold to the St. Louis Museum. 2 mummies remain unaccounted for. We don't know what happened to them. There is some evidence that Charlotte had facsimile 2 as late as 1918, and Stan Kimball, in a dialogue article entitled "The New Light on Old Egyptian," has a good article about this fact. The recovery of the Metropolitan Museum of Art's pieces that they own in Joe Smith papyri and its aftermath is really the significant event in the basic history of the papyri, and it's at this point that the intellectual history explodes. Now, who wrote the papyri, and when was it written? Those are questions and some confusion among Latter-day Saints of what was happening. There were 5 papyri on the Joseph Smith collection. We have the Scroll of Horror, which contained facsimiles 1 and 3, and the Census text. So that Scroll of Horror is the most commonly analyzed portion of the Joseph Smith collection. Horror was an Egyptian priest. He was the son of the great governor of Thebes, and while some fragments of his text survive, much of the scroll was probably destroyed in the Chicago Fire of 1871. Then we have